everyone. My name is Merve. I'm a bit nervous because I have to first set your expectations, which should be quite low at this point for this paper because it's a work in progress. And it is a paper based on my ongoing, hopefully soon to be finishing PhD. And because it's a work in progress, it has a lot of things to do yet, but I will be sharing, and the title suggests two things, but I will be only talking about one part of it. So just a bit more for the background, my PhD is on mainly focusing on father's parental leave take-up, and I am working on Luxembourgish data, focusing on the parental leave reform and parental leave policy in Luxembourg and father's leave take-up behaviors. And in this paper, I am focusing on father's parental leave take-up from an intra-couple negotiations point of view. And when analyzing focusing on father's parental leave take-up, I'm taking this leave take-up decision from the timing of the parental leave take-up, so deciding when to start the leave, and also secondly, when you decide to take the leave, for how long that leave is going to be. So there is these two decisions to make for parental leave, so the timing and duration. While in the full paper, I have two different sets of analysis. I will only now focus on the duration part, but later with the audience here, I can share the rest and to borrow some ideas. Yes, so this is the background. So what is the research question, or what is the point in this paper? Is to try to understand to what extent intra-couple negotiations influence father's parental leave take-up duration, so the duration of the parental leave. And the train of thought was, so the negotiations and the decision-making and negotiation here, or the decision is, of course, I am here having apologies from everyone, but having heterosexual normative language. So I'm focusing on the two parent households with different sex parents. So I'm not talking about single parents or same-sex couples. So my language will be quite gender normative. So apologies for that. So when making these kind of decisions between parents, between co-parents, between partners, so there are different aspects to consider. So there is the monetary resources, there is the time resources, and there is the cultural attitudes, gender ideologies. And the monetary resources and the time resources are actually also related to the workplace conditions. So how I am basically defining or why these concepts are derived in this paper is coming from this relative resources perspective, resources being the time and the income. And for the relative earnings, what I am taking into account, parents share in the household income. And for the household income, I'm only actually, for simplicity, focusing on the income coming from the paid work. And then the relative earnings here represent the share in the total income of two parents, which also relates to the workplace characteristics and number of hours spent in paid employment. And this number of hours spent in paid employment also relates to the relative resources in the sense the time resources. So this means the greater the time in paid employment will actually mean lower time to be allocated for responsibilities at home, which my point here is mainly care responsibilities. And there is also aspect of gender ideologies and the attitudes and more behavioral attitudinal aspects, which is mainly driven from the cultural background, education, or the value of care. But basically in the data, because I don't have any variables actually specifying, I don't have any attitudinal questions or any information regarding education, so I won't be really speaking much to that. I will only have the closest variable I have is nationality, so I can relate somehow to maybe to cultural background, but I will not go much to that. But making of this decision has different aspects, and one of the aspects is this as well. So what do we know, just as a background, what do we know about father's parental leave take-up from the existing research? We know that father's parental leave take-up is higher when the leave is generously compensated, when the leave is designed as an individual entitlement, and when the leave is non-transferable. So when the policy doesn't allow parents to actually transfer the leave from one to the other. And we know that fathers, when the policy has this father reserved days, it makes a difference. Then it kind of acts as a nudge, and fathers tend to use at least that part. And when those nudge is not many fathers are actually taking up. And we know that father's parental leave take-up is not a simple decision, or it's beyond one's individual decision. I mean, in the end, it's an individual decision, yes, but it is a complex decision, and it is not only depending on one's individual characteristics, but it also comes to life under the influence of workplace characteristics, such as this can be the sector, the work company size, the composition of the workforce, or it can be related to the partner's characteristics and partner's workplace characteristics as well. And also more qualitatively, there is also the behavioral and cultural elements, but this we know mainly based on the surveys, and so it may always not necessarily easy to provide this information, at least for my side, because I don't have in the data in these questions. But we know from the literature, the attitudes, behaviors, gender ideologies are playing an important role. What do we know about intra-couple negotiations? We know that the transition to parenthood comes with a lot of new responsibilities. And these new responsibilities are often competing with parents' existing responsibilities, which may require parents to either reconsider how do they divide the labor in the household, or they may be, so this is an assumption, the reconsideration, because they may also be for the first time considering how to divide the labor in the household. And this also, here when I talk about the division of labor, of course, the literature is quite wide, and the type of domestic tasks are also differentiated. So the care responsibilities, care provision versus household tasks are two different type of tasks. So usually the household-related tasks, let's say the cleaning, shopping, and all those things, cooking, are more mundane tasks, and parents are not necessarily, they may not necessarily value that or enjoy doing it. Whereas care responsibilities, provision of childcare, being a carer for their own children, it may be a burden, of course, but it's at the same time it comes with a potential emotional return. So the literature also actually differentiates the household-related tasks, so which makes all these conversations even more interesting, because there are three different things, as you see in this slide. That one thing is child well-being is not necessarily anymore a private matter, and because a lot of research already shows that a good early childhood experience actually relates to quite positive outcomes later in life, so which has a lot of benefits at different levels, both for the individual level, for the family, for the household, and as well as for the society. So provision of securing a good quality early childhood stage where child well-being is of concern for many different parties in the society. There is also another aspect of which is associated with having transition to parenthood, which is called motherhood penalty, and just the opposite, fatherhood premium. So there is a financial risk associated with having a child. So all these coming together actually makes left parents to make certain decisions. And in this paper, I'm drawing from a relative resources theory, which suggests initially, one thing is that the literature suggests that families tend to behave altruistically. So they are trying to meet their expectations. They are trying to make decisions at their best interests. And there is two aspects here. One, to protect their life quality, which is to protect family income. And the other is to meet child's care needs, which may actually leave them in a position which is threatening their existing income level and sustaining the existing quality of life. So we may think that it depends. Actually, here it comes to what extent they value the care, or how do they define, so what care means for them. So both in qualitative and quantitative terms to meet the child's care needs. So with what kind of decisions they should make. And drawing from relative resources theory, it suggests that actually parents, the couple, tends to allocate their resources, household resources, according to their economic resources. And if they have, whichever the parent has the greater bargaining power, whichever the parent has the greater economic resources would have the greater bargaining power. So this is what literature suggests. And it also says when man's bargaining power is greater, then the division of labor is more gendered. Of course, this division of labor, this part of literature is primarily driven by the division of household tasks, but it's more or less in the same lines are happening. And also in the same direction, literature also suggests that there is indeed a conversion regarding men and women sharing tasks more equally. However, this is, on one hand, it is slow, and on the other hand, this change is not necessarily happening linearly. So we see it from the literature, it says that yes, men increases their participation in domestic tasks, if especially they earn less than women. However, there is not a linear relationship. The relationship is quite non-linear, and even if the man is actually dependent on the woman, they are still not necessarily making more, contributing more than women. So there's also this aspect of like negotiations and the power dynamics coming from the individual financial resources and relative resources to each other. And also on top of this, of course, as I tried to visualize in the first slide, it is not only the decision and this bargaining power is not only coming from the individual, intra-couple relationship, intra-couple resources, but also the extra-household factors, then which we can add the society and the available services, access to services, and as well as workplaces. And for me in this paper, from that angle, I will be only covering workplace characteristics. But I think the first session was quite relevant, and for me to think how actually the also available services define the value of care, and from not only from the parent point of view, but from the policy, how policy defines this value of care and how do they meet the needs or define. I think it was interesting and it is quite relevant, this extra household resource allocations and resources power. So this was how I started thinking. And then I came to Luxembourg, so how the parental leave looks like in Luxembourg, and why it would make sense to actually take this position, in the sense that looking at intra-couple relationship and the influence of these intra-couple characteristics as well as extra-household characteristics on fathers' parental leave take-up decisions. So in Luxembourg, parental leave is available since 1999, which is falling after the first parental leave directive of European Commission. And since the beginning, meaning since 1999, which was reformed in 2016 and still live, parental leave was always a paid leave in Luxembourg. It was always an individual right. It was always non-transferable, and it was always conditional on employment. And it was always equally available for whichever parent is eligible. However, there is a tweak, because in Luxembourg, it is defined the parental leave. There are two parental leaves. So one is supposed to be taken right after, at the end of maternity leave. And one of the parents has to be obliged. So they are required to take that leave for the other parent to be able to use the second leave. So even though the leave is an individual entitlement and it is not dependent on one another. There is this kind of a push effect that to encourage to be able to benefit basically from two leaves available. One has to take it immediately after the end of maternity leave. So the parents basically earn this right with each newborn, and the same-sex couples are also eligible. Self-employed parents are also eligible. So unemployed is not eligible. And there's also a contingency to the number of times spent at paid work. So parents has to be already in the social security system. And in 2016, there was a reform happened. And with the reform, the modalities of use has changed. So the leave became more flexible in the sense that before the parents were allowed to choose to take the leave from full-time or part-time mode, but now they can also take it in more fractions modes, which means that they can take over a 20 months period, they can take any 4 months, or they can reduce their number of days per week working days, basically from 5 to 4 days, and they can work 4 days a week over a 20 months period. And the compensation is increased, so we can say that it became more generous. It used to be a flat rate payment, but now the compensation level is calculated depending on the number of hours per week, number of hours worked times their last salary, which means that the parents who are working full-time is getting a different amount than the parents working part-time. But there is a cap, so there's a minimum and maximum compensation level. So even if you are working full-time and even if you are making more than 3,500, then basically you will still lose some amount of your income. So because maximum you can get is around 3,500 and minimum is around 2,500. So you can't have less than that, but you can't also have more than that, even though you are working full-time and with so many hours, with a large salary. And the coverage also expanded. So it used to be that parents could take the leave, the second leave. The first one has to be taken right at the end of the maternity leave. The second one could have been taken up to child's 5th age, so after up to 60th month of the child. And now with the reform, it is 72nd month. So until the child turns age 6. And the eligibility also was expanded. So the marginal part-time workers, meaning that parents who work between 10 and 20 hours, they also became included now to the parental leave scheme. So what we know from the previous studies that we have conducted, that this expanded eligibility it didn't really speak much to fathers because fathers tend to work full-time. So that part of the reform spoke more to the mothers. And from the eligibility discussions, we had seen there is this change, which is potentially suggesting a greater coverage. However, in real life, it was not necessarily the case because actually those who were ineligible before were not necessarily eligible because of number of hours. So indeed, there was some improvements with this factor, but it didn't bring a breakthrough in the sense of eligibility expansion. And we did the short-term evaluation of this report, and what we found out, there was some 20% increase in first-time fathers' parental leave take-up right after during the first 18 months after the childbirth. So this was our main finding. And if you see the graph on the right, we see this is based on the absolute numbers provided from the government, that yes, indeed, there is a steady increase over the years in parental leave take-up, mothers being the majority of leave takers. But we also see a jump basically of fathers' leave take-up, which in my analysis, it did only for the first-time fathers and for the first 18 months after childbirth, which was translated as 20% increase. So overall, we see there is a progress in general take-up and coverage in parental leave take-up in Luxembourg for fathers. On this background, what I expect to find is when fathers have greater economic advantage in comparison to mothers, meaning that if their financial resources, relative economic resources, are greater than mothers, then they would take the leave for shorter periods. Because this would basically, and the opposite of this also would hold, meaning that if fathers are taking shorter leave, and also more flexibly, so I can add more details to this part, that it would suggest mothers have lower bargaining power. And it would also, it's like a two-way relationship. So if fathers has the more power in terms of finances and time, then we would expect them to be less engaged in the sense that taking longer leaves. So they would be avoiding from taking longer leaves because, again, going back to families being altruistic and to be protective of their living conditions and finances, so they wouldn't actually go for their income so much. And on the opposite end, if the mothers have a greater bargaining power, in the sense that if mothers are strongly attached to the labor market, meaning that if they are working higher number of hours per week and if they are earning higher amount of salaries, then actually this would push fathers to take leave longer, which is actually, literature already suggests that when man is partnered with highly educated and higher earner women, they tend to take parental leave. And also I would expect, in the first part, I would also expect, which I will not go to that part in the analysis, but the idea is that when the mother has greater power, actually, they may also push fathers to take the leave earlier. So now we wouldn't expect that. So for this part, to make the analysis for the duration of leave, we are doing a multinomial logistic regression because our outcome variable is a categorical one. And for the duration, I am using this co-residential parents joint leave take-up decision as the outcome variable. And I have 3 categories for this. So my base category is mothers taking the leave longer than fathers. And then the groups that I'm comparing with them is they are sharing the leave equally, or fathers take leave longer than mothers do. And for the relative resources theory, I have 2 main indicators to measure their relative resources. One is, as I already told, is coming from their relative income, and one is coming their relative time use. But of course, I should be careful with my selection of words. Time use only here for the number of hours spent in paid work per week. So for the relative economic power, I am calculating that deducting mother's salary from father's salary and dividing it by their total salaries. And if it is 1, it means that father has the absolute income power. So he is the sole income provider. If it is 0, then they would have equal income. And so it's a scale between 0 to 1. And for the paid work, the time spent in paid work, basically I also did something similar to the outcome variable, how I did. So if they work for equal hours, if mothers work for longer hours, and if fathers work longer hours. And here the base was they work for equal hours. So they are mainly working in full-time employment. And I also used a workforce composition, so the share of employees younger than 46, share of female employees in their workplaces, and share of white-collar employees, and some other workplace characteristics like company size, activity sector, and public-private, that division, as well as their nationality and the child's sex. And for all these workplace characteristics are separately for each parent. So I have all the information, both coming from fathers as well as their partners, because also this data is Social Security Register data and everything is linked to each other. So for each father, I actually have their partner's characteristics as well. So it works quite well. And this sample is actually quite a selective sample already, because I am working with parental leave eligible parents who are Luxembourg residents and they are co-residential parents. So they live, and they are first-time parents. So they are living together with their one child. And in general, this sample they are mainly, so the norm for them is working full-time. They mainly work in private sector and they mainly work in large-size companies. The main difference between mothers and fathers in this sample was coming from their workplace characteristics, because it looked like that they tend to be working more feminized companies, meaning that the number of females working in where mothers work is higher. So there is the type of work they do. So maybe we can even go a little further and suggest that there is some sort of a gender segregation in how, like, the type of work mothers and fathers do. And we also find out that the parental leave take-up was similar to what we have seen in overall general, like, national statistics, that the take-up for around almost 90% of mothers were taking parental leave, whereas this was only 1/3 of fathers in the sample. And when we look at the type of leave the parents take, then we saw mothers tend to take the leave in full-time mode, whereas fathers, it was half for them. So fathers also benefit from part-time option. So I'm very close to finishing, so it won't take too much from here. But basically what I did is to look at the joint leave take-up decisions of the couple. And before coming to these three categories, I have actually checked, so for the full-time, part-time, and flexible take-up, but flexibility is, of course, I didn't have many people in those groups because that was introduced with the reform, and that's only a very short period of time. And also because the parents, actually, if the one of the parents takes the leave right after the maternity leave, there is still quite some time for the other parent to take the leave. So there is this kind of little important details, but so that's why I tend to stay on the safe side, and I will be mainly speaking for the full-time and part-time leave take-up. And what we have seen is actually, for about 44% of the households, fathers were not taking any leave, but mothers were taking the full-time leave. And again, for about 15% of fathers, the couples, fathers again were not taking any leave, but mothers were taking part-time leave. And only about 12% of couples were defined, this how we define as parental leave reach, meaning that both parents were taking the leave in full-time mode. And about 8% of the families, fathers were taking part-time and mothers were taking full-time leave. And about almost 4% of them, they were taking both part-time. And this doesn't add up to 100, if anyone was calculating. It's because there's some few remaining percentages where some of the parents were taking leave flexibly or in different combinations, but mainly driven from these different options that parents choose. I have created these three categories, and then it turns out that majority of 70%, a huge majority of the parents were actually families where mothers were taking the greater part of the leave. And then they were sharing it equally. And then there were also a group of families where fathers were taking more leave than the others. And then I put them into the regression. So I am here only showing a few, only the significant variables, which actually confirmed. I'm coming to the conclusion. So this is the table for the relative ratios. And it shows that, yes, actually, there is a negative association between fathers' relative share. So if the father has a greater income compared to the mother, and yes, their leave take-up is shorter. So it was as expected. But I also find some interesting things, which is that the nationality playing an important role, pushing towards the positive direction. This is I need to explore this part a bit more, but basically it was also For one, because this group of parents were already parental leave eligible and they are taking leave, so they are already quite a selective group, and it's a bit different than general population, especially if you look in their nationality groups. And what was important here is to see that the reform is making a positive impact. However, it's the degree of the association changes, so from positive to negative. So yes, this was actually as expected, as what we have found before in our previous study as well. The reform indeed pushes more fathers to take leave. So we can say that it is encouraging involved fatherhood in Luxembourg. However, it still doesn't lead to a paradigm shift in the sense that fathers are not necessarily taking more leave, which was not really an expectation. However, the analysis also confirmed that. So to conclude, and parental leave in this study, with the parts that I haven't shared, that I am concluding that it's a complex decision in the sense that we can say that it is a two-stage decision. And so parents has to decide when to take the leave and also for how long to take the leave. And actually the factors driving these decisions are different from each other. So I'm not finding exact same things for the timing of the parental leave. So it is when deciding to time of the share, the leave is more of an individual decision. It's more individual power is more important. But when you decide the time of the duration of this leave, it's more of a result of a negotiation. And also because we find the nationality and some of the employment characteristics are also playing a role, which also suggests that extra household factors are also important in making this decision. So it is, again, it actually goes hand in hand with the argument that child well-being is not a private matter. So is parental leave in a way. And yes, the father's economic power in comparison to mothers, they make them take the leave shorter when they take it, of course. There is a negative association between working in public sector and taking longer parental leave, but this may be more of a Luxembourg specific case, and also because in this sample, majority of my sample was already in private sector, so this may also be of question. And also I find that the economic resources are playing more important role than the time resources. I could also add skills resources, but I didn't go into that direction. And it was again promising to see that 2016 parental reform was making a positive influence. But of course, the change, it's not necessarily changing the narrative of gender ideologies in Luxembourg, which is something to be more actually discovered, especially coming from a historical, attitudinal point of view. I think I will stop here. Thank you.